Child language acquisition, 3 little words. So let's take them on at a time. Child, when to start being a child. For many people, language acquisition starts around about 12 months when kids say that first word, but don't forget the first year. At the first year, our first year of life is very important as well, and indeed before you are born, remember there are a couple of months before you are born, when you're actually able to perceive in the womb something of the language that's around you. So language acquisition starts earlier than most people think. And it also ends later than most people think. When does child language acquisition stop? Well, in a sense, you know. We are all children, we stay being children all in our lives. There is no obvious endpoint for learning sounds. Of course, there is for learning grammar, there is for vocabulary, I mean that goes on for the rest of our lives in million or more words in English. Most of us only have a vocabulary of 50, 60, 70,000 words, whatever it is, until there is always something to learn. So remember that two ends of child language acquisition are wider apart than some people think. That means there is more scope for studying in it than most people think. Now we spend a lot of time thinking about how climate will affect crops. But crops affect climate themselves, and they do this in 2 ways. First of all, about 1/4 of the land surface is used for growing crops. Another 10 to 15% are used for pasture. So a substantial amount of the land surface is used in crop and agricultural production. And how we used that land affects our climate. If we were, for example, to deforest a substantial area and replace it with a natural crop such as soybean, then we would alter the characteristics of the land surface, alter the way that water and heat flows from the land surface to the atmosphere and back, and ultimately change the regional climate if there is a large enough change in land surface. So this is an absolutely fascinating topic, and one that's really quite difficult to understand because of the complexity. It's difficult because it needs us as crops scientists to work even more closely with our climate scientist colleagues. And it's difficult because we have to join our models together. Crops affect climate themselves, and they do this in 2 ways. And one is that crops ultimately change the regional climate change if there is a large enough change the land surface, and this is fascinating and difficult to understand because of the complexity. So, crop scientists need to work with climate scientists and join their models together. One of the things that was going on during the Great Depression was the beginning of this sort of modern food technology that rules, the way Americans eat today. That is, there are a lot of canned foods were coming onto the market at the time. And also, refrigerators were really becoming very, very popular during the Great Depression, both in cities and in rural parts of the country. Thanks to electrification, the Rural Electrification Administration, people could buy appliances. Farmers could buy appliances. And that meant frozen foods were becoming big. And, at that time, few people could afford to buy them during the early years of the Great Depression. But, gradually, these things picked up. And, so this was, like, the sort of beginning of the era when people were starting to think about supermarkets with rows and rows of freezer cases and rows of canned foods. Semantic noise in communication is a type of disturbance in the transmission of a message that interferes with the interpretation of the message due to ambiguity in words, sentences, or symbols used in the transmission of the message. Let's take a step back for a moment to provide a larger framework that helps you understand the idea of semantic noise a bit easier. Communication is the process of transmitting information from one person to another. Information is a pattern of data organized in a particular way. For example, a sentence consists of symbols that form words in a particular language with a particular meaning. The sentence also utilizes grammar, which is a recognized way to structure words forming a sentence. Noise is any type of disturbance that interferes with the interpretation of the information. Some argue that noise exists in all communication. Semantic noise doesn't involve sound but rather ambiguity in words, sentences, or other symbols used in communication. The ambiguity is caused because everybody sees a different meaning in the same words, phrases, or sentences. The differences in interpretation can be quite small, even undetectable, in regular communication between people from the same culture, age, education, and experience, or drastically different because of such things as culture, age, or experience. But you can see from the relatively crooked and narrow streets of the city of Rome as they look from above today. You can see that again, the city grew in a fairly ad hoc way, as I mentioned. It wasn't planned all at once. It just grew up over time, beginning in the 8th century BC. Now this is interesting because what we know about the Romans is when they were left to own devices and they could build the city from scratch, they didn't let it grow in an ad hoc way. They structure it in a very methodical way. That was basically based on military strategy, military planning. The Romans, they couldn't have conquered the world without obviously having a masterful military enterprise, and everywhere they went on their various military campaigns. They would build camps, and those camps were always laid out in a very geometric plan along a grid, usually square or rectangular. So, when we begin to see the Romans building their ideal Roman city, they turn to that so-called castrum or military camp design.